Perfect. Thank you very much. And as the father of ravenous twins, I found the last talk absolutely fascinating. And so today I'm going to speak about how I believe wearables can provide new insights in the role of behavioural traits in cardiometabolic disease. So there's been lots of advances now where many of us walk around with Apple Watches or Fitbits in the technology of wearables, and they're collected in ever larger cohorts. And I believe there's a huge potential for these devices to really transform our understanding of the causes of, consequences of, and treatments for cardiometabolic disease. So at the Big Data Institute at Oxford, I lead a group of around 10 to 15 researchers who are actively working on curating larger data sources, creating methods to use these wearable sources of data, and also then making those tools widely available for others to use as well. And a key driver behind this work is that for behavioural traits such as physical activity and sleep, we know that they are important in cardiometabolic disease, but we're not quite sure exactly on the strength of the association between these behaviours and cardiometabolic outcomes and the shape of the association. So if, for example, we look at previous existing evidence, that tries to assess the association between self-reported physical activity, and in this case coronary heart disease, whereby on the x-axis we've got self-reported levels of strenuous and any physical activity, and the y-axis we've got associated event rates. This is from the Million Women study, and I could have really picked many other studies as well, because there's genuine uncertainty as to, for individuals who exercise more and engage in more physical activity, there is it's a controversy over whether those individuals actually get further benefits or decreased risks, or whether in fact there might be something detrimental to doing extra or additional physical activity. And the honest answer is we don't really know, because we've been ever slightly operating with our hands tied behind our backs, because we've been relying on measurements of, in this case, self-reported physical activity status that are crude and unreliable. And just to highlight that point, when the NHANES study in the US and the Health Survey for England study here in England about 12 years ago gathered self-reported physical activity information and accelerometer measured activity. So think of an accelerometer as a research-grade Fitbit type device, and they tried to assess the amount of adults meeting physical activity recommendations. And as you can see from the results, there are really different estimates as to the amount of adults who meet physical activity guidelines. Now, no measurement instrument is perfect, but accelerometers are certainly much more strongly associated with gold standard measurements of physical activity energy expenditure in laboratory environments than are self-reported activities. And also there's emerging evidence from smaller cohorts showing that objective measures of physical activity and fitness are more strongly associated with mortality outcomes than self-report. And I could have given the exact same introduction with regards to sleep as well, whereby we've essentially relied on self-reported measurements of a behavioural trait. So as a result, there's a number of, I believe, key unanswered questions, such as how strongly is wearable measured physical activity and sleep associated with, for example, incident cardiovascular disease. Also then, what types of activity might it be best to engage in? Additionally, does activity causally lower cardiovascular disease incidence? And finally then, is there an opportunity to embed the ever increasing and prevalent wearable sensors as an opportunity to embed these in clinical trials? So to answer these questions, what we really need then is a large-scale prospective study of wearable measurements, whereby individuals are followed up longitudinally uh, for, for, uh, for a very long period of time, and also then associate genetic measurements to facilitate causal inference. And of course, in the UK and indeed the world, we're very lucky to have the fabulous resource that is the UK Biobank. This study, the component that I'll mention and focus on today is the physical activity monitoring component. This particular component is at least 5 times larger than any other equivalent study in the world, and just the range of phenotypic and genetic data associated with this. It's just a truly excellent resource for research into physical activity and sleep traits in particular. So as part of the Biobank, then, we have measured physical activity status on just over 100,000 individuals. We sent them out a device that looks like this, essentially a research-grade Fitbit, and it records how a person moves forwards and backwards, side to side, and up and down, and it does so 100 times per second. So for each and every participant in the UK Biobank dataset, we have recorded about 180 million data points per person per week times 100,000 individuals. And there's obviously a computational challenge in dealing with that, and a much greater challenge then in trying to carefully process this data to extract a clinically meaningful measurement of physical activity status. So we convened an expert working group together with colleagues in Cambridge, in Newcastle, and other universities across the UK to essentially develop this careful data processing pipeline whereby we consider whether devices are sufficiently calibrated, whether to remove effects of machine-related noises and vibration and gravity, and also then to detect if a device has been worn or not worn, and to appropriately adjust our analysis based on that. And this method then has been validated against doubly labeled water, which is the viewed as the gold standard measurement for physical activity energy expenditure. So this information is now, and has been for a few years, been available in the UK Biobank Data Showcase, and it allows us, first of all, to do some simple descriptive statistics, such as representing what a 24-hour model of human movement behaviour looks like, in this case, about 100,000 Biobank participants, whereby x-axis is the hour of day, y-axis is mean acceleration. Higher values indicate that a person is more active. And we can, for example, see then that both men and women, older participants, are quite noticeably less active than their younger counterparts in the afternoons and early evening time. And where this is now is truly valuable is that, as with any prospective cohort study, it becomes more valuable as time accrues. So our colleagues and collaborators in Cambridge then have published this fabulous paper about 8 months ago in Nature Medicine, and associating this wearable measurement of physical activity status with all-cause mortality outcomes. So this particular analysis had around 3 years of follow-up events. X-axis is essentially accelerometer measured physical activity, and y-axis is the hazard ratio for all-cause mortality. So again, we've seen a very strong and steep slope, and much steeper than has been observed before using self-reported measurements of activity. And recently then, our own group here in Oxford, in collaboration with Terry Dwyer and colleagues at the George Institute, have conducted a 5-year follow-up then of the accelerometer measurement in UK Biobank. In this case, looking at associations with incident cardiovascular disease outcomes. And what we see is almost a linear association as one moves through the essentially activity quadrants. with respect to associations with incident CVD. And there are two key things to note. So one is that shape of the association, that there's no evidence whatsoever for people in the most active quadrant having adverse additional or adverse effects with respect to cardiovascular disease. And secondly then is this strength of the association. So all current physical activity guidelines that have been issued by, for example, the Chief Medical Officer here or the US Surgeon General, they assume that people in the top quadrant of activity have about a 20% lower risk of cardiovascular disease compared to those in the lowest quadrant. What we're finding using the device-based measurements is perhaps up to a doubling of the strength of the association between physical activity and cardiovascular disease than was previously thought. And of course, again, we will be conducting additional careful analysis of this as time accrues in this longitudinal cohort. But even just simple measurements from wearables are highly valuable already for use in healthcare research. But of course, we really want to push the boundaries further and to ask questions such as what types of activity are associated with in this case, cardiovascular disease, but could also be your favorite cardiometabolic disease of interest. And the intuition here is that we're gathering this high frequency information that's representing the three dimensions that a person moves. And what we would really like then is to identify patterns or signatures in those behaviors that indicate if a person is sitting or walking or driving or running, for example. And it's here then where machine learning methods can be incredibly useful because they can help provide some insights in what's particularly a non-interpretable form of data. But before developing a machine learning method, it's important to train it adequately as well, and particularly in free living environments, which is where people then are wearing these devices. So we've collated a validation study here in Oxford, and I hope the video comes through okay. And essentially we've asked about 150 individuals to wear a camera around their chest that takes first-person point of view images every 20 seconds or thereabouts. So you get essentially as near as one can get in free living environments to a gold standard measurement of behaviours. And then associated with that, we have the wrist-worn accelerometer. And then from on the bottom, as you can see, the waveform, and from that we extract a series of time and frequency domain features. We then put it through a random forest classifier to make a preliminary prediction on whether a person is asleep, sedentary, in light activity, or in moderate activity. And following that, we apply a hidden Markov model to essentially smooth over those time series predictions. The intuition of it is if my classifier says a person is sleeping, bicycling, sleeping, it's unlikely someone went off for a 30-second bike ride in the middle of the night, so we smooth over the erroneous classifications. And how well does this work? Well, pleasingly very well. So in this particular validation data set, we've got around 2,500 hours of annotated free living behaviours. So it's really key. This is not in the laboratory, this isn't free living. We have gone with these four major types of behaviour categories: sleep, sedentary behaviour, light activity, moderate vigorous activity. And we've achieved a kappa score then versus the camera ground truth of about 0.8 or thereabouts. So not perfect, but getting pretty good. And to recognise each and every one of these activities, and certainly good enough for population inference at scale. So we've deployed this method then that just considers the accelerometry information to identify these behaviours to the UK Biobank cohort of about 100,000 individuals. And we can see then the majority of the population are unsurprisingly asleep or engaged in sedentary behaviour most of the time. And what we'd really like to do is associate that then with incident disease outcomes, but we can't use kind of an off-the-shelf logistic or linear regression model, because they assume that, for example, if I look at moderate activity, what I traditionally like to do is say, well, if I had an hour extra moderate activity, I assume a unit increase to that, holding everything else constant. But we can't do that because a day is 24 hours. I can't create an extra hour in the day. So therefore, I have to take time out of either sleep or light activity or sedentary behavior. So in this regard, a compositional data analysis approach is much more appropriate to use when analysing with incident disease outcomes. So our own group then has recently released this preprint then showing the association of machine learned behavioural phenotypes with incident cardiovascular disease. This is 5 years follow-up and around 3,500 incident CVD events. And I'll talk you to the one on the top left-hand side, an intuition for these plots. So in the x-axis, we're kind of looking at the trade-off of sleep versus sedentary behavior, whether I do more sleep or more sedentary behavior. And then the y-axis is an estimated hazard ratio. So we can see the intuition here then is that as one moves from doing more sedentary behavior at the expense of sleep, there is an associated then increase in risk of incident cardiovascular disease. And the most striking of these plots is clearly on the bottom, where if one moves from either sleep or light activity or sedentary behavior into moderate activity, there are some very steep associations and potential quick gains, for individuals when thinking about associations with incident CVD. And of course, what I've shown then can be very much prone to the, bugbears of observational epidemiology, namely residual confounding and reverse causation. And we really like to use some forms of causal inference. And it is here, as with many other fields, the use of Mendelian randomization methods is highly appealing. So at Oxford then we have published some of the first genetic variants associated with a machine learned sensor phenotype as depicted here. So we've got decent heritability to play with, around 20% for the traits, for some of the traits, and have currently identified 14 genome-wide significant loci then associated with these various traits. And that, of course, first of all opens up exciting possibilities for doing the standard range of in silico analysis, for example, showing that the central nervous system and brain traits are highly enriched with respect then to the variants that we have found associated with accelerometer measured physical activity. Somewhat mirroring in what Cecilia presented earlier, then I think this is unsurprising for a behavioural trait. And with respect to Mendelian randomization, then there have been studies then using our variants, including published by ourselves too, suggesting that increased overall activity reduces diastolic blood pressure, odds of being diagnosed with hypertension, and odds of being diagnosed, I guess it's not a cardiometabolic trait, it's quite an interesting one, and odds of being diagnosed with depression. But there's currently no evidence for an association with, for example, coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, or ischemic stroke. But I would very much like to caution that I think as wonderful as UK Biobank is, it's perhaps not quite large enough yet for physical activity or wearable sensor genetics. Because we've only identified a handful of instruments thus far that are associated with these traits. And indeed, a recent publication and looking at a variety of lifestyle factors has shown perhaps least amount of interest in physical activity, but I think that's almost fully explained by the fact we've only got 4 or 5 instrument variables thus far, but we have got ideas and plans then to, I guess, to improve our ability in this through additional phenotyping, more enhanced genetic ascertainment, and also through larger data sets as well. So I think this is a very, so currently I would view the activities in this space as providing hope and excitement. I think a clear amount of potential, but we can certainly build upon this too. And finally, I'd just like to very briefly show that wearables can certainly be embedded in clinical trials. There's a really nice example published a couple of years ago from the Timmy group at Harvard, looking at heart failure population that oral nitrates as to whether they could improve activity levels, which is a very important endpoint in heart failure. And the primary endpoint in this particular trial is a accelerometer measured physical activity. It's a relatively small trial in 110 participants, and what I would personally love to see is the use of wearable endpoints in, I think, particularly heart failure trials to start with, but much larger ones, because we can now do this at scale and remotely and very feasibly and efficiently. And indeed, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative in the US, which is supported by the FDA, then has released a set of recommendations in the use of mobile devices in clinical trials. So this is, I think, very much an interesting space that will become more and more important as we begin to test whether particular treatments then can just make key changes to attributes that are important to patients, such as their ability to be active and their quality of sleep. So in summary, I hope I've convinced you that wearables need to be embedded in major human studies of cardiometabolic disease. UK Biobank is fabulous, but we are actively working on enhancing and increasing the scale of wearable measurements in other cohorts here in the UK and also China. Additionally, there's I think a clear need for reproducible machine learning methods to measure behavioral phenotypes from wearables. These need to be informed by diverse validation data sets and to help us identify new phenotypes around sleep, around circadian rhythms, and also multimodal integration of wearables with other omics, I believe could really aid our ability then to discover potential new targets. So we're really excited to be working in collaboration with the Novo Nordisk Genetics Centre here at Oxford. So watch this space for new findings in this regard. And related to that, then we are hiring and actively looking at the minute for new personnel with backgrounds in either machine learning or genomic discovery. If you're interested in joining us in this voyage and adventure, please do get in contact with me. And thank you very much for your attention.